Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're here this evening, the first Thursday of the month, for our monthly webinar. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the overview of public education funding in Vermont. It's a riveting subject, and I know that you'll find it interesting. I'm Susan Holson, the Director of Education Services at VSBA. I'm joined this evening by Carrie Lamb, our Director of Operations. If you should have any technical difficulties during the course of the webinar, please call Carrie at the office phone number, which is there for you on the slide. She can walk you through, talk you through, and help you get through whatever issues you may have. We're also lucky enough to be joined this evening by Emily Byrne, the Chief Financial Officer at the Vermont Agency of Education, and Brad James, the Education Finance Manager, also at AOE. They're going to take over the audio in just a moment. First, let me just walk you through some of the logistics of our webinars for those of you who may not be familiar with our format. You'll be seeing a PowerPoint presentation on your screen. If you have any questions as we go along, you have a dialog box there where you can type in your questions. We'll have a few pauses during the program to particularly elicit any questions that you have, but please feel free to type them in anytime during the course of the hour. We'll be monitoring those and answering them as they come up or holding them for those breaks. When we finish the webinar, you'll see on your screen a link to a very brief evaluation. I think it's 3 questions, and we'd very much appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to strengthen the material and the programs that we offer to our members. You'll also get an email follow-up from us early next week, which will provide you with summary information, a video of the PowerPoint slides with the audio, and any additional information that we may talk about during the course of the evening. This and all of our other webinars are archived on our website, vtvsba.org, and also on our YouTube channel. So if you have a topic of interest and you have questions, I encourage you to take a look at the archives. We may have addressed it at some point in the recent past, and it will be there for you to view. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our guests for the evening, and I'll be back with you as we go on. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. I'm Emily Byrne. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Agency of Education, and with me is
Brad James, and my title is Education Finance Manager, and I really don't know what that means.
We're going to take some time tonight to go through the education funding system in Vermont, and hopefully it provides some clarity on an important and somewhat confusing topic, I think, to most people. So hopefully by the end you'll have a better understanding of how it works. So we'll jump right in. So as a high-level overview, we'll go over the education fund itself, go through the sources and uses to the education fund, also sometimes the revenues and expenses at the statewide level, and then dive into the local issues. So how local tax rates are calculated based on what's available in the education fund, go into how equalized pupils are calculated, which is a critical component of what determines tax rates. And then we'll go through a couple of scenarios around what some possible tax rates might be and certain changes and how that will impact local decision making. So at a high level, an important point we always like to make is that Vermont does not have a per pupil funding system for school districts and supervisory unions. A lot of states have a funding formula where the state appropriates a certain amount of dollars on a per student basis, and then that's provided to local districts as revenue for their schools. Vermont does not do that.
We did used to do that at the beginning of Act 60, but that stopped when Act 68 started in fiscal year 2005. So it's important to repeat that. We don't pay based on a per pupil basis. A lot of people think we do. We don't.
We don't. So at a high level, how the funding works, it's sort of a 4-step process. So the local districts will adopt budgets. Those districts then submit the budgets to the Agency of Education after they're approved by voters, hopefully on town meeting day, sometimes a few days after. And then AOE takes all of those budgets, we add them all together, and we determine sort of total ed spending. And based on all of that information, we also determine what local education spending is on a district by district basis. And based on those calculations, the AOE then pays each district with the calculated education spending, plus any other grants that the state has appropriated for specific purposes to each local district.
And that's how education funding is done? We're done. Emily wants to keep going on. Okay.
So to start, the education fund itself is sometimes the biggest or the second biggest fund in state government at about $1.6, $1.7 billion. The general fund is also about $1.6, $1.7 billion. So it's a significant piece of what the legislature appropriates and the spending that happens from state government. To the education fund itself, there are multiple taxes that are deposited into the fund. The one that gets talked about the most and the one we'll spend the most time on tonight is the homestead property tax. And then we'll dive into the details of that later in the presentation. There's also the non-homestead property tax rate. So that's the rate applied to all commercial and non-primary residencies throughout the state. There's also 100% of the sales and use tax is deposited into the ed fund. And I'll go into a little bit of detail later on that, but historically it used to only be about 1/3 of the sales tax went into the education fund. In this past legislative session, the decision was made that 100% of the sales and use tax would go to the education fund. 25% of the meals and rooms tax goes to the education fund, so that's any taxes paid on hotel rooms or at restaurants. And then 33, or 1/3, I should say,
That'd be easy.
1/3 of the purchase and use tax is deposited into the education fund. And the purchase and use tax is what's paid on the purchase of motor vehicles. And is there anything else to purchase and use tax?
Airplanes.
Airplanes?
Boats.
Yeah. Finally, any proceeds from the lottery, so any net administration costs and prizes, any funds that are generated as associated with buying lottery tickets are deposited into the ed fund.
And that one always raises a lot of questions because we get phone calls, and you may too, for all I know, but we get phone calls saying, "Can you tell me where the lottery dollars go?" And I say, into the education fund. But they want to know, well, where do they go from there? Which school districts? And it doesn't matter. Once a dollar gets into the education fund, it loses its identity. It's just a dollar. And so it's a big pool of money, and it just gets swirled around and goes out. So there's no way to say lottery dollars go anywhere in particular.
Finally, there are 2 other sources to the ed fund. There's the what we grouped as other is a transfer from a special fund that we call the Medicaid special fund, and some other smaller taxes that don't rise to the size of some of the other sources to the education fund on solar panels and on wind turbines. And then the final one, and there's been a little bit more conversation around this one, is transfers from prior year balances. So to the extent the education fund, maybe there's more revenue raised than was initially projected, and the expenditures are less than was initially projected, there may be a balance generated in the education fund at the end of a fiscal year. The legislature, the last 2 legislative sessions, have used those balances that are generated as funding streams into the education fund. So as there's been discussion about one-time funds into the education fund, that is generally the source of that is unspent prior year balances in the education fund. So this next slide is just a high-level picture of sources into the education fund. The size of the boxes reflect the size of the amount of revenue from each source. So you can see that the 3 biggest contributors to the education fund are the homestead and the non-homestead property tax and the sales and use tax. The education fund itself is used to support several appropriations that go directly to schools. The biggest one is local education spending. So that's what schools determine they need to operate their school districts and supervisory unions. There's also, the state picks up 60% of special education costs. So there is a almost $200 million appropriation from the education fund for special education costs. There's aid for transportation that's paid. The state picks up, I think, 50% of transportation costs.
Up to.
Up to.
It's gets prorated down because it uses a demand that's a little bit higher than the 50%. So it's usually like 46, 48%.
That's very specific.
Yes.
There's also the aid paid to schools for state-placed students. The state picks up all the costs associated with state-placed students. Technical education aid, so the legislature appropriates some funds to help offset costs of CTE centers. There's additionally some funds appropriated for schools that are very small and in rural areas to help offset their total costs.
And also included in that line on the ed fund are the small schools grants districts that Consolidated were getting. They turned into merger support grants, so they're also on that line.
The next thing that comes out of the education fund is the Essential Early Education Aid, which is sometimes also referred to as the EEE program. This is special education support specifically for students ages 3 to 5. The Flexible Pathways grants that come out of the education fund support some of the newer programs out of the education fund, like the early college program, dual enrollment courses for students. The next one, which gets a little bit into the sort of technical pension terms, is the normal cost of teachers' pension. The legislature decided 2 years ago to shift this expenditure into the education fund, and the normal cost of a teacher's pension is essentially the amount of money needed to be invested in the pension to cover the associated costs when the teachers that are currently employed retire. There has been some discussion in the news about the pension obligations of the state and what is needed. The normal cost of teachers' pension on an annual basis, if we had kept up with the requirements to ensure that the pension was fully funded, is about $8 million on an annual basis. However, the unfunded liability that's currently picked up by the general fund is closer to $70 million. And then finally, the last cost to the education fund is the administrative services. So that's the cost to operate the accounting system that makes sure all the money going in and going out is accounted for, and the audit of the education fund that happens every year. So just another way to look at all of those uses of the education fund in a picture. The green block is local education spending, so that's the payment to schools to operate school, essentially. And then the balance, the rest of the pieces of the education fund are the categorical grants. Those are sort of the other colored bands on the top of the graph. And just at a high level, those categorical grants total about $261 million. The biggest one being the special education aid at almost $200 million. Then state-placed students, transportation aid, technical education aid, small schools grants, and early education aid. So those grants go to all schools. They're formula driven. They are essentially offsetting revenue, which we'll talk to later in schools' budgets. So a lot of times we talk about education spending specifically, and that is a very specific term when we talk about the ed fund and calculating tax rates. So when a town or a union school district adopts a budget, they adopt the budget is reflective of total expenditures. So we talk about that as budgeted expenditures. If there is a deficit from a prior year, which we hope there isn't any, but if there is, that gets added to the current budget that's adopted by the town, and that's reflective of budgeted expenditures. Then we look at those budgeted expenditures and we deduct what's expected in revenue. So all schools in the state get the state categorical grants that we just looked at. So aid for special education, aid for transportation, for example, and all schools receive dollars from the federal government to support special education, to support struggling students. What else is federal funds for?
I forget. I'm not, that's not where my head was.
That's not where your head was.
No.
So there's federal funds that are distributed to the schools. We subtract, based on what the budgets that's adopted by the town and union school districts, we subtract all of those other revenues that go to those schools to come up with what we call education spending. In this past year, education spending was about $1.3 billion. This was before we had the healthcare recapture, which was one of the ways that the legislature tried to manage spending in the ed fund in the past year.
That's when they were trying to manage how health care was done for the teachers. And they wanted them all to go to single contract in a certain pattern. And if you recall, 2 legislative sessions ago, at the very end of the session, that's when that came out. This was the compromise, that they would assume that everybody was doing certain criteria in terms of their health care planning. And that therefore, since we were assuming that they were doing this, we would be there would be money to be taken back from the ed fund. And so that's what we did. We took 65% the first year, which was last year, which is about $8.5 million. And then the remaining 35% this year, which is about $4.5 million. So basically, we figure out what we owe you, then we take back X amount of dollars.
Yeah, and that wasn't only in an FY 2018 and FY 2019 change. There will, as far as we know, there will be no healthcare recapture in FY20. But the legislature did make a decision last year that we would be moving to a statewide bargained agreement for healthcare for all teachers. So that will be in the works through the next year. So the education fund spends about $1.6 billion annually. 261 million goes out in the categorical grants. There are some other uses, which are what are the other? I'm drawing a blank.
I didn't bring a balance sheet.
The other uses are the administration and the normal cost of teachers' pension. So they aren't specifically related to schools, but they do have a direct nexus to education. And then there's the net education payment, less the healthcare recapture, which is how we come up with the $1.6 billion of education spending in Vermont. To offset, or the funds that make those expenditures possible, come from all of those sources I talked about prior. And I wanted to just put a side-by-side in the presentation because there was some significant changes to those revenue sources in the last legislative session. So the first big chunk that comes is the non-residential property taxes. So again, the amount of taxes paid on the non-homestead commercial properties or apartment buildings, industrial properties throughout the state, which is the same rate for all properties in all towns across the state. In FY 2019, the legislature made a decision. Historically, there was a transfer from the general fund into the education fund. There was always a back and forth at the legislature around whether or not it was fair, for lack of a better term. The general fund transfer had a statutory increase on an annual basis, and that statutory increase was always transferred to the education fund regardless of how the general fund was performing. And there was some back and forth around whether that mandatory transfer should always happen to the education fund or not. So the decision was made that rather than have this statutorily growing general fund transfer to the education fund on an annual basis, that they would change out some of the appropriations that were in the education fund, but also shift the entire sales and use tax into the education fund. So if you look on the second line, you'll see that the sales and use tax, which used to be a third of the sales and use tax, would go into the education fund, increasing to the full amount of the sales and use tax going into the education fund. What will probably be discussed in the legislative session is the sales and use tax this past year. There was a Supreme Court decision around online sales tax that will increase the amount of sales tax paid to the state of Vermont. And by making the change this past year to put the entire sales and use tax into the education fund, it means that any revenue generated over and above what historically was generated as a result of that Supreme Court decision will go to the education fund. So the legislature and the governor's office will probably negotiate whether or not they want that full amount to stay in the education fund per the change that was made this past year, or if that money will go elsewhere. So additionally, the purchase and use tax is in the education fund. That has remained pretty stagnant. It's a third of the purchase and use tax. The meals and rooms tax, that change also occurred last year in the change from the general fund transfer and the sales and use tax. To balance the fund, it wasn't a one-for-one change, so they also transferred 25% of the meals and rooms tax is now directed to the education fund. The lottery, which is always not necessarily predictable. I anticipate that the amount of people that bought Megabucks and Powerball tickets in the past couple weeks because of the
I made my donations.
because of the level that it got to, there will be an increase. There will be additional funds from the lottery going into the education fund. Additionally, the Medicaid transfer and the other taxes are relatively small. And then this past year, there was a transfer from prior year funds that were left on the bottom of the education fund unspent that were allocated in FY 2019 as one-time funds to hold down property tax rates. So if with that, oh yeah, so if you notice on the bottom line, the slide prior, we talked about the education fund needed $1.6 billion based on the expenditures from the fund. After we go through all of these sort of fixed sources to the education fund, we only raise $1.2 billion. So the balance of those funds comes from the homestead property tax. So again, the education fund owes about $1.6 billion to school districts. And then that money, the homestead property tax is in effect the sort of balancing mechanism in the education fund. So we figure out how much we're going to need to spend. We determine how much revenue we're going to get from the non-homestead sources. And then the item that balances the fund is the homestead property tax rate. So before we dive into how the homestead property tax is calculated, and I turn it over to Brad, I wanted to see if there are any questions.
I don't have any yet, Emily. I'm just waiting to see if anybody chimes in and types a question in the box.
Great.
Well, I don't see any questions, so let's carry on. And if they come up, we'll address them in real time.
All right, that's fine. So Emily left me with the fun things to talk about. The homestead property tax. So again, as Emily said, we on the non-homestead tax, we raise about 1.2 billion. We need about 1.6 billion. The remaining 400 million or so is from the homestead tax. Again, most of you are aware that there are tax credits that are calculated. People pay based on their income. In this current year, FY19, they're about $169 million due to tax credits that stay in people's pockets and do not leave their pocket, and so they pay a reduced homestead tax. So they're paying based on income. So we had about 590 million raised. Was supposedly raised, but about 170 million was not raised. It stays in people's pockets. So it's net about 430. The homestead taxes rates themselves are based on per pupil spending, and then once you pay them, you're paying based on either a percentage of your market value of your home or a percentage of your income for those people who have incomes basically below 90,000, household incomes below $90,000. It tails off a little bit above that, but that's just the residual of the calculation, and we don't care. So the question is, why do the homestead tax rates vary? Since you guys are school board members, most of you know this already, but I'm going to say it anyway. The rates vary as the average per pupil spending varies for a school district. So if you spend more per pupil, your homestead tax rate goes up. You can see that in that lovely equation in italics right below. If the denominator is staying constant, but the education spending in the numerator increases, your spending per pupil increases, and therefore your tax rate goes up. We'll come to how that calculates in a moment. So in this very quick example I have here, and it's completely hypothetical, I have an education spending million of roughly $4.3 million. And I have an equalized pupil count of 300. When you divide that roughly 4.3 by 300, you come out with the spending per pupil figure of $14,308. That's a lovely figure. What does it mean? Well, we'll come to that in a second. So before we can say what that $14,308 means, we kind of have to talk about the base amounts that the legislature sets annually. The first one is the property yield. It's this current year that we're in, it's $10,220. This is the property yield, and the income yield is right down below, and the non-residential tax rate are all going to be addressed by the tax commissioners in his December 1st letter, which is it's going to come out with recommendations and starting points for everybody. At this point, we don't know what they are. Some people in the background are working on them. That would be some of us, in fact. So anyway, the property yield this year is $10,220. The base homestead property rate was fixed in statute at $1, and your rates are levied on 1% of your fair market value. Your homestead rate will also vary based on what your spending per pupil is, but the base is $1. You can't be below that. The base non-residential rate set this year was $1.58, and the income yield was $12,380. The reason the income yield is higher than the property yield, because people ask that question sometimes, and I like to tell them, is because if you're paying based on your income, you are not paying your full property tax, so you're actually getting more bang for your tax dollar. So in order to make this work out, the income yield is higher than the property yield. And again, we'll show how those are used shortly. And the base income rate, like the base homestead property rate, is also fixed in statute. The base income rate is 2% of your household income. So if
Brad,
yes.
I'm sorry, it's Susan.
Right.
Can I interrupt for a second? We did get a question come through on the Ed Fund discussion that I don't want to lose.
Sure.
So I'm going to interrupt you if you don't mind. The question came in from Cynthia, and the question is, will small schools grants continue for schools that have not merged? And it appears some won't be required to merge.
That's a very interesting question, and the statute was changed. The small schools grant statute was changed in Act 46 of 2015, which caused the mergers too. And basically what it says now is that the small schools grants are no longer guaranteed simply because you're small. They put a new criteria. You can be geographically isolated, which is, you know, undefined, although people like to think it's defined. Or you could have bad roads between you and the next nearest school's capacity. But what the law says is that the state board is going to come up with a criteria, and if you meet some of these criteria, then you apply to the state board, and they will tell you whether you get a small schools grant or not. Once we know who gets the small schools grants, then we'll calculate them. But it's actually an application to the state board. At the moment, it's not saying that nobody's, you know, that small schools grants goes away. People think that that's not the case. It's a different process now.
It's just changing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And let's go back now to the tax rates, and I do apologize for the interruption.
That's okay. We don't mind going backwards. We do that together all the time. So the property yield, people say, well, what's the property yield? Well, let me read you the technical definition, which is in statute. It says the property dollar equivalent yield, i.e. the property yield, means the amount of spending per equalized pupil that would result if the homestead tax rate were $1 per $100 of equalized education property value and the statutory reserves were maintained. What does that mean? Well, there are probably about 8 people in the state who know exactly what that means. A better way to think about it, whoops, I'm going the wrong way, is think of it this way. If the property yield is $10,220, for every $10,220 per equalized pupil a school district spends, the homestead tax rate's $1. If you spend 10% more, the homestead tax rate's 10% higher, $1.10. Okay, that's how it works. It's an easier way to think about it. Same thing with the income yield, although the calculation itself is a little more convoluted than I'm showing you here. But for the income yield, basically, and again, this isn't technically correct, for every $12,380 spent per equalized pupil, an eligible taxpayer pays 2% of their income. As I said, it's a little more convoluted than that. We can come to that a little bit later, but that's kind of just the broad idea. So I think those are better ways to think about the yields, kind of turn it inside out. So this chart kind of shows you exactly what I just said. If you're spending $10,220 per equalized pupil, your tax rate would be $1. But the first number in the top, in the left column, is 11,242. That's 10% more than the 10,220. Your tax rate's $1.10. As you work your way down, you go 10%, 20%, 30%, till the number in red, 14,308, the number that we were looking at earlier. That's 40% higher than the 10,220. So your tax rate, your equalized tax rate, is $1.40. By the same token, if you look at the income yields, you'll see that the income yield is $12,380. But if you're spending $11,242, you still have a homestead percentage income yield of 2%. That's a floor. You can't go below that, just like you can't go below the dollar tax rate. So it's not until you get to the 13,286, which is 30% more, that you see a change in the household income percentage. So it's the same process. So in the red that's highlighted, if you take that 14,308 and divide by 12,380, you get 2.31%, and that would be the percentage of household income. It's again a little more convoluted than that, but that's the general idea. Let's see next. Okay. So, in the example that I threw at you, I said the district rate was a tax rate of $1.40. That was what we did a couple slides back. So that's the equalized rate. When I say the equalized rate, most of you probably heard of the CLA, the common level of appraisal. The CLA is, well, let me back up 1 second. The equalized rate is the rate that would be applied if all the properties in town were assessed at fair market value. They're not in any district or not in any town in the state. They may be close, but they're not at exactly 100%. So that's where the CLA comes in. The tax rate is adjusted by the CLA. So the CLA, the common level of appraisal, is the town's assessed value of its education grand list divided by what the state thinks that grand list is worth. And the state does a study, the tax department does a study annually, and they use 3 years worth of data because we have lots of small towns. And what they do is they look at what the actual sales were in the town, what properties were selling for, and they compare that to the town's listed value, and that's what the CLA is. If it's 95%, if the town has a CLA of 95%, that means it's 5% below what the state says its fair market value is. If it's 106%, that means it's 6% above what the state thinks it was, or what the fair market value is. So what happens now is, because you have differing values of properties within in town, in the different towns, the state, what's the state? Well, the state, instead of adjusting the town's properties, it adjusts the tax rate. So the dirty secret behind all this is that you are taxed. You pay taxes based on your fair market value, not your assessed value. That's done by adjusting the tax rate. So you take the tax rate and you divide by the common level of appraisal, by the CLA, and you get the rate that shows up on your bill. In the case that the slide that we're looking at, if your equalized rate's $1.40 and your common level of appraisal is 93%, you would divide $1.40 by 93%, and you come up with $1.5054. So how about if I say it 1.5054? It sounds a little bit better. That's the rate that would appear on your bill, and that's what your property tax would be based on.
And I've gotten the question recently, how do I know what my CLA is in my district? And my answer has always been to look at what it was last year, and that's probably the best estimate for what it will be this year, barring any known big reappraisals in your town. So
or a giant building project.
Or a giant building project. So that's usually the best indicator of what it will be next year.
And the tax department is right now. They're in the throes of doing their equalization study for all the towns in the state, and they're coming out with the CLAs. They usually start coming out usually in early to the second or third week of December. They're usually starting to come out. They kind of come out in batches. I never see them until usually January, because the tax department forgets about me, forgets to send them to me, so I have to remind them that I'm still there. But you guys will get them. I think they get sent to your superintendent, they get sent to the town clerks, so they do pop out. And it is a number, and when they show up, the business managers like seeing them also. Okay. Anything else you want to say about that? All right, so here's kind of a calculation using numbers that you've seen for how you come up with a tax rate. And this is a somewhat simplistic version of how tax rates are calculated, and I'll explain that in a second. But you start off with your expenditures. When we talk about expenditures, we're talking about every dollar that you're going to spend on your students, including federal monies, and also if there's a deficit, or if you happen to belong to one of the 3 standalone regional technical center school districts, it's a mouthful, when they set their budget, your tuitions are then a legal obligation, so you'd add that to your budget too. You don't need to vote on deficits in those obligations. But in this case, the expenditures for this hypothetical school district are just over $4.5 million. We have offsetting revenues, as Emily was talking about, consisting of federal monies, transportation aid, special education, perhaps tuitions, perhaps a donation, perhaps interest-bearing accounts, a surplus of $250,000. When you subtract those two numbers, you get education spending, and there's the number that you saw on that earlier slide, $4,292,400, which I call 4.3 million. That number is divided by equalized pupils of 300, and there's that $14,308 per equalized pupil, education spending per equalized pupil technically. That spending per pupil then is what drives your tax rate. So when you take your spending per pupil and divide by the property yield. So when you divide that 14,308 by 10,220, you get the $1.40 that you saw earlier. That means you're spending 40% more than the base education amount, so your base tax rate is 40% higher. So it's $1.40. Your CLA, as we said, was 93%. So your actual homestead tax rate that you would see on a tax bill, you take the $1.40 divided by the 93%, just like we did before, and you get 1.505 for $1.5054. That's how it's done. It's a piece of cake. What's missing in here that I didn't put in was the excess spending threshold. That is still in play. It would fit in. Where would that fit in? That would fit in between lines 5 and 6. The excess spending threshold this current year is $17,816, if memory serves me correctly. If you're spending over that amount, you get double tax on the amount over. So if I simplify it and say the excess spending threshold is $17,000 and you're spending $17,200, then instead of me calculating your tax rate on $17,200, I would say, oh, this district is $200 over the excess spending threshold. So I take that 200, add it to the 17,200 and come up with 17,400, and that's what your tax rate is calculated on. What saves a lot of people who are spending a lot is that there are allowable exclusions listed in statute. Mostly they're principal and interest payments on eligible capital debt projects that have been around for a while. Those can lower your amount. So in that hypothetical example I had, let's assume that you had excess spending exclusions of $500 per pupil. What I would then do is I would take that $17,200 figure, subtract 500 from it, and say, oh, for the purposes of excess spending, you're only spending $16,700. You're under the threshold, even though you're actually spending $17,200. And so then I would calculate your tax rate on $17,200. Okay, that's pretty easy, isn't it? Emily's going, yeah, huh?
Yep, this makes perfect sense.
Okay, so I didn't show that on this sheet, but be aware that's there. I think this year there may be 6, 7, perhaps 8 districts that are over the threshold. So you get your tax rate. So what? So how do you know you've got your tax rate now? What do you do with it? Well, if we take that $1.5054 and just say it was $1.50, and you have a house site value of $200,000, you're taxed on 1% of your house site value. So 1% of $200,000 is $2,000. Your tax rate was about $1.50. Multiply the $1.50 by 2,000, and your tax bill would be $3,000 in this scenario. That's what a taxpayer who pays on their property taxes fully would pay. Basically, for every penny on a $200,000 house, for every penny of tax rate, it costs them about $20. So if your tax rate spikes by 3 cents from year to year, for somebody who has a $200,000 house, that would amount to about $60 a year. Okay, so $5 a month. So what I would like to do, I think, at the moment is switch to an Excel file, just so you can see all these pieces play out. So if I jump back one slide, I'm pointing on my screen. I hope you can see my hand pointing.
I can.
Okay, Emily can see it, so that's all good. What the Excel file is going to do, and I'll send this to you, or I'll give it to Carrie to send out to you guys, is it's going to be this, but it'll show you how things change. Your business managers have things similar to this. They're a little bit more convoluted and detailed because they have to do a little bit more. They have the excess spending threshold and such in it. So let me make this a little bit bigger here. Let's see, where's view? Up there. Oh, Emily knows how to do these things quickly. I don't, so I don't care. So let me make that larger. You're not working. Okay. Whoop. Pay no attention to the man running the computer here.
You want me to do it?
No. Okay. Can everybody see it? Well, you can't tell me if you can see that. I'm assuming everybody can see that. Okay, so here's what you just saw on that slide. There's the 4.5 million budget, the $250,000 offsetting revenue, the roughly 4.3 million education spending, 300 equalized pupils, 14,308 for spending. There's the yield, the $1.40 equalized rate, 93% CLA, and the $1.50 actual rate you would see on your bill. Down here, down below, that you can't see because I'm not low enough, this part right down here, again, I was about to point to my screen. This part right here just kind of explains each line. And again, I will put this out there so you guys can have it and see it. Ignore the stuff over here for the time being. So if you change, as I said, your tax rate's based on a spending per pupil number. So if you watch this number here, and by the way, the equalized rate is the rate that you use to compare tax rates between towns, because not all towns are assessed at the same rate. So when you're comparing tax rates, you should be using that one right there, the equalized rate. So if your equalized pupil count was to go up, was to increase, but nothing else changed, this is a question, and shout the answer, what would happen to your tax rate? I have to hit enter, don't I? You're right, it goes down. Very good, all of you. It dropped from $1.40 to about $1.35 by having an additional 10 extra equalized pupils. That's why your equalized pupil count and your ADM count is so important. Ask your business managers, they will tell you. If it goes the other way, down to 290, your tax rate goes up to about $1.45. Okay, so that's kind of how it's working. By the way, we don't have 3,000. When you get this file, the red cells, you can enter data in them and things will change. If your revenues change, your offsetting revenues, let's say they drop because you don't get something all of a sudden, again, your tax rate, because your education spending went up, your spending per pupil went up, your tax rate goes up. Okay, I'll go backwards. Obviously, if you spend more money, it's going to happen. If the yield changes, and that's what's going to happen with the December 1st letter, let's assume it goes up. I have no clue, but let's assume it goes up to 10,500. That changes your tax rate too. Your tax rate drops because you're getting more for your money. Does that make sense, people? Yes, they all said. Okay, they're all on board. Okay. We'll come back to this part in a second. Let's see where I am in my neck there.
And so, and I think it's important when it comes to the yield to point out that the yield gets calculated based on what the state is going to pay,
right,
or what the state anticipates we're all going to spend on public education. So the calculation of the yield can't be done until we know what everybody anticipates they're going to spend, which is why the education fund has a sort of self-balancing around the tax rate component versus the expenditures. And the legislature, the first sort of iteration of the yield comes in the December 1st letter based on forecasts, and then throughout the legislative session and after town meeting, that's the number that the legislature is debating and how that number drives the statewide average tax rate.
Right, right. Okay, so let me jump, whoops, there's the Excel file there. So or the PowerPoint. Let me jump back to PowerPoint for a second. So we did this one, we did that one. So here we're talking about the homestead income rate, and we'll do this fairly quickly. But this is for eligible taxpayers whose household income is below $90,000. The current year tax bill that they'll see now is adjusted by the prior year property tax amount minus the income amount. That amount, those two equals the tax credit. So very quickly, the way you figure out the income yield. Whoops, I've got the wrong file up. I'm going to move this because I have something in my way. Okay. All right. Calculation of the homestead. It starts out the same way. You go all the way down to your spending per pupil, and then your spending per pupil now instead of getting divided by what was the property yield, the income yield of $12,380, and you get a percentage. Basically that's roughly 15% more than the income yield. That gets multiplied by 2%, and the household income percentage, then the HIP, is 2.31%. This is the number that determines people's tax credits. It is not used in the year it's calculated. The tax credits are, as I said in that last slide, are a look back of 1 year. So this number would be used, this number calculated this year would be used in FY20 for those taxes. Jumping back to the PowerPoint again. This is just the income rate calculation. Again, I'm not going to go through it much, but there's that 14,308 divided by 12,3. We didn't do the rounding the same way, so it's off by a little bit, but you come out with 2.32%. Okay, so when you have tax rates, some of you, not everybody, not as many people anymore, are in systems where there's a union high school or a union elementary school and then other school districts like a local elementary school or something. If you're one of those towns that belongs to more than one school district, you get your tax rate is calculated based on both. Both school districts calculate a tax rate. And it's broken out based on the percentage of where equalized pupils go. If you're in the hometown of Burlington, Emily's nodding, she's there. And 60% of your equalized pupils go to the pre-K in Burlington Elementary, but 40% go to some union high school. Your tax rate follows accordingly. The Burlington Elementary rate is $1.40. The union rate is $1.70. The Burlington Elementary component is 60% of $1.40 or 84 cents. And the Burlington Union component, that $1.70, you get 40% of the $1.70, and it's 68 cents. You add those two together, and you get $1.52. That $1.52 town equalized rate would then be divided by whatever the CLA is for that town. Okay? If you're a single town district like Jamestown happens to be, then your tax rate, you work it all out, your tax rate comes out to be $1.26, and that's it. Your equalized tax rate's $1.26, and you divide by the CLA. All of you who are in new unified districts, all 21 of you out there who have new unified districts this year, and 8 the year before, and 4 the year before that, you do this. You are a single district. You get the equalized rate, but each town has a different CLA. So they would have the same equalized rate, but they'd have a different actual rate on their tax bill because they have a different CLA between the member towns. And we'll stop there. That was a lot. So there may be questions. So fire away.
Well, we'll start off with a question from Dan in Marlborough, who asks, what percentage the household income percentage tops out at? I'm not quite sure what he means by that question, but I think the question really is, at what point does that stop?
Well, I can interpret that two ways. There's no maximum percentage, but I think the question is really based on what's your household income. At what point do you not see a tax credit? Basically, the majority of the tax credit is from $90,000 on down, but because of how the formula works and the calculation, it actually goes out to around, I think this year, around $136,000. People might get $1 or $2. It tails off pretty rapidly after $90,000, but I think it goes all the way out to roughly $136,000 this year.
There is a slope on the tail end to try to mitigate the impact, so that if you make $90,005, there isn't a sort of shock in terms of your tax rate.
Well, that's not really why they did it. It just
happens that way.
It's a vestige, yes. Other questions? Don't tell me I was that thorough and understandable. I don't believe it.
While we're waiting for other questions, I just want to say to the school board members who are attending the webinar, this can be very overwhelming when it's thrown at you this fast and this thoroughly. So in part of the packet that you'll be getting from us after the completed webinar will include not only Emily and Brad's slides, but if he's willing to share it, also that Excel spreadsheet, so you can experiment with plugging in some numbers and understanding the impact that they have.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And we are waiting for more questions. I have a bigger question that's not specifically about this, which I think we'll hold to the end. I know you have a lot more content, just want to be mindful of the time. We've got about 6 minutes left.
Yep, I was watching the time and I was thinking maybe we want to kind of jump over equalized pupils because that can get pretty tedious and not walk through all those slides. Just with the understanding that equalized pupils are a way of the state getting or trying. Certain categories of students are presumed to have and do have higher costs than other categories. And so the idea behind equalized pupil is if you have a lot of those categories of kids is to bring your cost per pupil down kind of more to an average amount, which is kind of defined as an elementary pupil in your district. That's what it's about. And let me just jump to the slide that shows what the weights were. There's no weight for elementary pupils K through 6. So they're kind of the standard. Then each pre-K student is weighted, pre-K meaning regular education and special education, is weighted by, or is deflated by 0.46 because they're presumed not to cost as much. Secondary kids have an additional 13%. The poverty pupils add an additional 25% by formula. It's not just a straight 25%. And then each secondary poverty pupil adds another 20.28% because they're second. That's on top of, that's the 25% and the 13% together. And each English language learner adds 20%. Also, what I will give you, and I think it's kind of self-explanatory, is a second Excel file that kind of goes through the equalized pupil calculation. And once again, the red numbers here are numbers that you can change. But it walks to the equalized pupil file. I'll send Carrie and Susan a Word document too that kind of talks about it. But it kind of walks through the calculation. It's a 2-year average. You add in state place kids. They get weighted over here in this section here. Let's see. I'll just jump down here a little bit. This is the number that you start with to do the poverty calculation. The poverty weight down here gives you a total over in this area. When you see it, it'll be a little bit more explanatory. And then there's the ELL weight, the equalization ratio, which kind of, what happens is you basically, when you weight everybody, you have too many kids in the state, so the equalization ratio brings it back down. And then that's your actual equalized pupil count. And again, that was incredibly quick and incredibly ununderstandable, so we'll keep going.
And also generated a couple of questions.
Oh, okay.
Jim wants to know what the status of the weighting study is.
Sure. So the agency was asked to do a contract for the weighting study this past legislative session. We've contracted with the University of Vermont to review the weights that are currently in the education funding formula and to determine whether or not they are correct and whether or not the ones that are in the formula are the ones that should be in the formula. So should there be any added or subtracted, and should the weights themselves change? So that is in process. The report from the weighting study is due back to the legislature in November of 2019. So it should be pretty quiet this legislative session around weights as UVM does the work. But next, so in January of 2020, there will probably be a robust conversation around whether or not there needs to be changes to the weights in the per pupil allocation. And it's important to note, it doesn't necessarily change changing the weights doesn't change the total cost of education in the state. It will just change how it's allocated across taxpayers.
And the reason for that is the way the equalized pupils are done is it's kind of a zero-sum game. So if you change the weights, then what it does is just shifts who has them. So the equalized pupil counts go up in certain areas and go down in others. But it's kind of a zero-sum game. So that's what Emily's saying. It depends it makes a difference who's going to pay for it.
So I hate to have to cut you off, but it's 2 minutes of 7, and we don't want to hold our members up any longer than they've already volunteered to spend time with us. I do have one question that really pertains to the overview, and I'm not sure you have the information to answer this, but Dan is asking how much whether you can answer, how much the state has spent so far to implement Act 46 between grants and tax incentives, and how much the state is saving because of Act 46.
The savings, we have 21 unified districts that started this year, so if they have any savings, nobody knows about them yet. The question is, what are they doing differently? And it's not necessarily savings per se. It's more avoiding costs or reduce costs. You can look at that any way you want, but there have been 21 that just started this year, so we don't really know. Well, one of the things I'm going to do in the next probably 2 or 3 weeks is generate a list of questions for business managers. Say, what are you doing differently? What's working? What are you able to do differently? Are you shifting around teachers? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? What problems are you seeing? There's another 8 that started last year, so they're now in their second year, so they'll have a better idea of what's going on. And then from starting fiscal year 17, there were 4 unified districts. I do know that some of them had realized savings. I don't have the numbers at the top of my head at the moment, but I know that they were able to do things with their staffing numbers. They were able to shift people around from between schools, whereas before they couldn't because they were different school districts. Now they're not. So they realized savings there, not have to hire new people or let people go. But there have been a number of different things there. And then the last one was Mount Mansfield in 2016, and they have done different things too. So that's one of the things that I'm going to get to and come up with for everybody so that I can put it out there, because I know everybody wants to know that question. I just don't have hard numbers for that.
That's great. When you get them, we would be happy to pass them on to our membership. So I want to thank Emily and Brad. I think they've really helped develop an understanding on this very complicated topic. I know we didn't get through all of their material, and that is the nature of the beast sometimes, but you will be getting all of their slides. As always, we appreciate that you're taking interest and giving your time to your schools and your students and your communities. Thank you for your service. And thank you for participating in tonight's webinar. When we close out the webinar, you will get a link to a 3-question survey just asking how we did. And we'd love to have your feedback. And you always know you can find us here at the office in Montpelier via email, telephone. We love to hear from our members. So thank you very much and have a great evening.
Goodbye.